Welcome back to the Green Swindle. Now, for decades, world leaders have pushed the U.S. to sign an international climate agreement. But we discovered that these agreements are about much more than just the environment.
We all have to agree that the potential for serious climate disruption is real.
Our first step should be to set realistic and achievable binding emissions limits.
Now, that was 1997, and global warming hysteria reached a fever pitch. Now, the UN and the IPCC pushed hard for an international agreement that would require nations to reduce their carbon emissions, and the Clinton administration jumped on board.
Now is the time to cut back emissions, design 21st century solutions, and begin the steps necessary to return our planet to the stable climate balance that has been enjoyed by our ancestors.
Now, this set the tone for two infamous treaties that in the end were never signed, but they did expose the true agenda of global warming hysterics to punish the United States, redistribute wealth, and force developed nations to de-industrialize.
Notice that no agreement requires anything. No agreement tabled so far. There are several proposals. None of them require anything by the countries where emissions are not only going up, but skyrocketing. It's not about emissions. It's about us.
The push for an international climate treaty started with the Kyoto Protocol back in 1997, and when that failed, the second attempt came at last year's Copenhagen conference. In the latter part of the Clinton administration, the president made a strong push for a climate agreement.
As we get ready for the Kyoto conference, I believe there should be realistic but binding limits to emissions of greenhouse gases.
But the Clinton-Gore team faced a major problem. The U.S. Senate staunchly opposed any treaty that would harm the U.S.
The Senate gave unanimous, not bipartisan, nonpartisan support for a resolution instructing the Clinton-Gore administration, don't go to Kyoto in December and agree to this treaty or anything that looks like it unless it treats other countries like it does us, and or you guarantee it will not significantly harm the United States economy.
Even Democrats known for their environmentalism opposed the treaty, including Massachusetts Senator John Kerry, Delaware Senator Joe Biden, California Senator Barbara Boxer, and Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy. But that did not sit well with the vice president, or intervened to make sure the U.S. would sign the accord, regardless of what the Senate had to say.
After talking with our negotiators this morning, and after speaking on the telephone from here a short time ago with President Clinton, I am instructing our delegation right now to show increased negotiating flexibility.
With blatant disregard for the Senate, Gore agreed to a disastrous international treaty obligating the United States to reduce its emissions 5% below 1990 levels. Now, he also made it clear that he would go along with the environmental agenda at any cost.
It was absolutely a spectacular capitulation. I mean, utterly unthinking agreement to terms that were drafted by Europe solely to benefit Europe and solely to disadvantage us.
Now, critics charge that the treaty would have crippled the U.S. economy.
Projections are that electric rates would have gone up by at least 50%, gasoline at the pump by $1 a gallon, and natural gas prices between 30% and 50%.
They also say it unfairly targeted the U.S. and other industrialized nations.
The idea was for the industrialized nations of the world, the wealthy nations, to agree to binding limits on their greenhouse gas emissions. But developing nations, including countries like China and India, were left out.
It exempts 155 countries. It gives them a free ride. Of course they're on board.
Now, almost a year later, in November of 1998, President Clinton signed the Kyoto Protocol.
The agreement is environmentally strong and economically sound. It reflects a commitment by our generation to act in the interest of future generations.
The Senate, however, saw things differently and made it clear it would never ratify this treaty.
In my opinion, the Kyoto deal is dead on arrival. It is designed to give some nations a free ride. It is designed to raise energy prices in the U.S.
Now, Gore's maneuver in the Kyoto Protocol showed Americans' willingness to appease environmental extremists. Now, his spirit was revived at last year's Copenhagen conference, this time with President Obama leading the charge.
We come here in Copenhagen because climate change poses a grave and growing danger.
But the summit was thrown off course when a draft copy of the proposed agreement leaked out. Now, it showed plans to force industrialized countries to pay developing nations an amount equivalent to 0.5% of their GDP. In short, it would have levied a tax on countries like the U.S. to give money to poor nations. Like Kyoto, this was a blatant attempt to redistribute wealth in the name of the environment.
The third world has decided to use this treaty to bring about a massive shift of wealth from the United States to developing countries. In effect, what the third world, including China, is saying is we Chinese will lend you $100 billion and you pay interest, and then you give it back to us and the other third world countries to spend on cleaning up our environment and building more factories to compete with your American-made products. That's probably the worst deal that I've heard in all my 30 years in Congress.
While a global environmental treaty eludes us, Al Gore and President Obama have put the U.S. in a dangerous spot by showing that we will sacrifice our sovereignty for those who do not have our best interests at heart.